This week, we're talking about the election last Tuesday. Based on the results, half the people in the country are not going to be happy and half are going to be happy. There'll be fear, frustration, anger, joy, depending on how things went for you and the candidates you were supporting. And so we want to talk about what that looks like as Christians and how we conduct ourselves after the election. And so we'll be talking with Reverend Enoch Liao, pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical Church, and Reverend Sergio Perez, senior pastor of Harvest Ministries of New England. Guys, thanks for being with us again.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, guys.
At least I think I'm glad. I'm not sure yet.
And when I say guys, I'm using that very respectful plural form of reverend. And so we're recording this Wednesday morning, just so folks know. And so we know at this point that Donald Trump won the election. Kamala Harris has not yet conceded it. We don't know where the Senate's winding up, although we know there's a majority that it will be Republican. We don't know where the House will wind up either. But we want to take some time to speak into the election as we Christians are intentional, or to help us be intentional about how we live our lives in the midst of an election that was pretty divisive. But maybe so let's start with pastoral words for those whose candidates lost, whether that was the presidential or Senate or what it might be. And so Enoch, let's go left to right. And so Enoch, will you start us? And so what pastoral words would you have for folks?
Well, first of all, I missed the fact that Brother Ray Hammond is not here, because then Sergio and I can just sit back and listen to him.
You're right.
Yeah, and Ray did have a conflict, and
I'm sure he did. The conflict is that he's smarter than Sergio. I've thought about that a little bit, and I guess what I would say, not to sound super spiritual or sort of avoid your question, but I feel like the word I would offer is the same whether your candidate won or your candidate did not win. Obviously, there's certain words of encouragement, affirmation you might, but if we're trying to remember that if you view one candidate as wildly better than the other candidate, as a believer in Christ, we're still learning to put our hope away from things that we can control, that we prefer, like wealth, power, riches, even political candidates, even what some might consider upstanding political candidates. We have to put our hope in Christ. So I think the word of encouragement is God is still on the throne of the universe, and we're still called to love and serve with humility and do justice and share the gospel. It gets very different. Like if I know someone who's a young progressive versus a young conservative, or older progressive, older conservative, then I would encourage differently, because they're looking at the future of their lives or their children. But I think the main word is that the Lord's still in control, and he was going to be in control regardless of who won whatever election in whatever land or country we're in.
And so I hear in that, certainly for the message of the folks whose candidates lost, God is in control. But you mentioned just one word that's worth coming back to, I think, that for those of us whose candidates won, is humility.
Well, I'd like to think humility is an opportunity to be displayed the humility of Christ regardless of our situation. Sometimes in our maybe American context, you can only be humble if you're good, because you're not good enough to be humble at that sport or that activity. But that's a humility based upon I perform better or I've gotten the upper hand. But if humility in Christ is about recognizing that we are ultimately servants of his, and ultimately learning to trust in him more and more every day, no matter how young or old we are, no matter who sits on what throne or sits in what office, then I do think that this, whether we're rich or poor, we really should have the same heart of generosity. Whether we are famous, or whether we're ignoble, whether we're beautiful, or whether we're unsightly by the world, I really think those are important things. But in the cosmic scale, I hope this sounds okay to your listeners with no nuance. But in a cosmic scale, it's incidental. We're all the servants of Christ, and so everyone has the opportunity to show humility and grace in victory or in loss. And so I think whether you won or lost, the attitude is the same. How do we pray for our leaders, do justice, love mercy, share the gospel, love our neighbor? And I think if we were thinking, which I know some of us do, and I've been there too, if my trust in God is rocked by external circumstances, especially who wins an election, I would invite us to rethink where what might that suggest about where we're really hoping? Can God work in spite of whoever is in power, whoever is famous? And so that would be the encouragement. Again, not to avoid your question about, I get it's a great word to like those who didn't get their way. How do we encourage them? And I get that there's something very powerful there. You want to tell them, don't give up. You want to tell the winners, be humble. But I feel like it's really both messages to both sides, all sides, regardless of who wins. Because the next day it's someone else. It really almost, my spirit of humility, hopefully, doesn't really change. If anything, there's a kind of humility in victory that you don't get to display unless you truly, actually, that's when you know you're really humble, when you truly are gracious in spite of quote unquote victories. So that'd be an encouragement to really center upon our relationship with Christ as individuals and as a community.
Thanks. Sergio, let's bring you into the dialogue. And so what pastoral words would you have for folks on both sides, candidates won or lost?
Well, thank you, Charles. And thank you, Enoch, for being part of the conversation. And yes, we do miss Dr. Hammond in the conversation. But I want to share something very practical, very, very practical, being part of, the election process for so many years. I think one of the verses that has really ministered my heart in preparation to whoever is going to, win the presidency is when the prophet Samuel was sent to anoint Saul, and we know that Saul, wasn't the king that God wanted for the people, but the people wanted a king. And then it says in 1 Samuel 10, verse 9, so it was when he had turned his back to go from Samuel, talking about Saul, that God gave him another heart. And all those signs came to pass that day. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. And what I learned from this is that God does have the power to change someone's heart, people's heart. And when I mean people's heart, I mean the leaders. Something happens when someone assumes a responsibility, of that magnitude, that first they really think twice about, how they're going to do from here on. So in my mind, whether it was Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, I see that they have that space where, God can do something in their hearts to preparing for the task ahead. And that has been very comforting for me to know that, yes, God can work in the hearts of these leaders to accomplish his purpose, to a nation, especially when it comes to the United States, because when I see the Israel of the Bible, I truly see that, if there is a nation that is so close in comparison to Israel and the blessings and the promises and the covenant, I think it's the United States. It is so parallel to the Israel of the Bible in so many different ways that I see that, like I said in the podcast before, I believe that leadership matters, that they are important, but God has the power to, lead their hearts in order to fulfill his purposes for a nation, especially for the United States.
And so I assume when you're saying we're the closest, you're talking about being faithless, being rebellious, ignoring what God really cares about, or do you mean something else?
Yeah, well, no, I mean that it happens with every leader, everyone that has a new position, they have that moment of reflection, and it's like an evaluation. Okay, especially like in this case, Donald Trump, I think he has the benefit of, okay, he already did it once. What things I need to change, and I think he's in that sense a bit more mature when it comes to this second term.
Hope so.
Right.
And so there have been people on Madison Avenue and in tech companies who make billions of dollars off of making us discontented, fearful, and angry. That's their business model. And so as Christians, whichever side we're on, there was fear and anger on both sides. Can you guys speak into that? And what is that there's some level of anger that can be merited, right? Jesus certainly would seem angry at the Temple Mount when he's overturning the money changers. Where is an appropriate place for anger in this? And then let's talk about fear separately. And so, we both have anger on both sides. And so, Sergio, do you want to start with that one?
Well, it's very interesting that, for those that are probably a little more conservative, is kind of, people feel very lonely here in this blue state. I didn't know how blue this state was, but it's kind of disappointing. You don't even want to go to vote. People don't even want to vote. It's like, my vote will not count anyway. So, but look, what I can say is that I think it was Martin Luther who said that a Christian shoemaker should reflect his value or his testimony, not by putting crosses, on shoes, but to do good shoes. That's what they should do. Probably another way to say is that, if someone needs an open heart surgery, what would you choose? Would you choose a very consecrated Christian but doesn't have the experience, or you pick a pagan, a unbeliever, to perform that surgery, but he has the experience? I think that when it comes, at least is that my position, and since we have the freedom to respectfully, share some of our experience, and I think that when it comes to get things done, and be looking at beyond Donald Trump's personality, based on his previous experience, I think that he has the experience and he has the work ethic. And when it comes to work, when I refer to the work ethic, is that the energy to get things done. 900 rallies in the past couple of years. And in spite of defending himself in courts for weeks, just his mentality of just working, getting things done, and fulfilling pretty much what he has said in the past. I'm talking about to the first term. I think in that sense, I'm really confident that things will get done. And people will experience some benefits of his leadership. That's for people that are still stuck in mostly his personality more than in his policies.
Okay, and Enoch, what would you say? This emotion of anger that's been gymmed up in people on both sides. Is there a place for it, or is that a spiritual issue we need to deal with, or something else?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I appreciate the question and Sergio's remarks. I think anger is appropriate because I do think you're right. In the political arena, when you listen to actually how they market to get you to vote, not just for them. Actually, these are the last few elections in my lay political operative mind, because I don't really have a lot of experience in how political campaigns are run. Although we're here in Boston, so I actually have friends on campaign teams because I just live in Boston. It really isn't about changing people's minds. My sense was it was about getting people out to vote. I think maybe I just understand it differently as I got older, or maybe that is a genuine viable strategy now. I remember under the first President Bush, watching documentaries. There was this documentary I watched in the 90s, or maybe 2000s, I guess at this point, was like, if you can just get the evangelicals to vote, you can take control of certain political positions. And so at some point it became less about convincing people and more about getting your base to turn out. Yes. And I do think anger seems to be one of those things. But apparently the current administration's lack of your performance in your mind is a more powerful anger motivator than any marketing you might do, any phone calls you might do. And when it comes to anger and spirituality, I think it's important to acknowledge it. I think the Psalms are very honest when David is crying out in frustration. I feel like you can sense anger or frustration. But I'm a pretty, at least in my experience of understanding scripture, I'm a strong, I would attest to the anger of man very rarely accomplishes the righteousness of God. I almost want to say it's like Jesus, he knows the hearts of the scribes and Pharisees, so he can say some things that I would either not know to say or have the guts to say, or if I would say, I would say it, if a typical human would say it, that would just be probably unloving. But Jesus knows their hearts. That doesn't, now, if I know their hearts, I can speak a bold word in a public setting, but I don't have that access. So I'm inclined to speak with grace unless I'm really clear on the motivations, inner thoughts of people. So sort of blending with what Sergio said, I do think there's a lot of anger, but I would say that anger is a powerful tool. But I think for the most part, it gets us to move, but I don't think it should drive us.
Yeah. It's not for nothing that Star Wars is all built around give in to the anger, right?
Yeah.
And there's something in that. It's a dangerous thing, because even with Jesus, right? I would argue that when we see moments of anger for Jesus, I can't think of anywhere it's anger because of what you did to me, Jesus. It's anger about what you're doing to God. It's anger about what you're doing to other people.
Yeah, like I think when you read the Old Testaments and the prophets seem to be angry, it's really about the poor. It's about the spiritual poverty of the peoples. It's about how the children of Israel and the ancient children of Israel are not living up to the covenantal expectations that they had agreed and that God had put upon them in a righteous, upright way. When it comes to anger, though, even that part about Jesus in the Temple Mount, like in the Gospel of Mark, when you do that, there's actually a part where he goes into the temple, looks around, and then leaves. And then he comes back in later in the Gospel of Mark and overturns the tables. So there's a lot of interesting discussion about it may not be he got there and he just lost it and tossed the tables. It arguably looks like the way Mark writes it, a very calculated timing, almost like Jesus knew when to go in and do that. And he thought about it and came back. So when I encourage people, I go, let anger stir you into action, but let love and grace guide that action and inform the action. And make sure your anger is anger for God's glory and his righteousness, not because I'm so mad or because that other person is so terrible. So I would generally say anger is there. It's in the toolkit. I just think that his fallen people, there's probably more reliable or helpful ways to lean into that. Anger doesn't produce wisdom. Anger doesn't produce love. Anger can move me, and hopefully, but see, I don't need the Spirit of God to be angered, right? But I need the Spirit of God to curtail that anger, guide the anger into love and grace and wisdom and humility. And so, so those are just some thoughts. People are angry. They want to go write protests, write letters. I get that, but let anger may move you, but let wisdom and love and righteousness inform and guide you. Generally, what I say to people.
Yeah, and the deceitfulness of sin is I can rationalize my anger is I'm doing it for righteous and just reasons about what's being
absolutely.
There,
so
and it really is not.
My professor Norm Wright over at Talbot, he would say, I never looked up the study that demonstrates this, but he's written a lot of books and he's been very helpful. So he said something that said, anger makes you think you're right even more. You have to. That's why. We're not talking about counseling, but if you ever had the experience that the more you think about something someone did or said to you, the more angrier you're getting, that's usually because you're playing it over and you go, that's messed up. Well, that's really messed up. And anger always makes you think you're right. That's the nature of anger. And when you feel right and they're wronged and you are wronged, it's almost a cycle. So once you start thinking, no one's ever angry and then feels like it was their fault at the same time for the same thing, right? I'm angry in that moment. And sometimes you might have wronged me, but you might have wronged me like 20%, but I wronged you 80%. But my anger makes me focus on the self-righteousness that I have of you. You said that, it's like someone stole something from someone else, but then they went and told people like, I'm so mad you gossiped at me. I'm so angry at you. And okay, maybe there was a proper Matthew 18, Galatians 6 church discipline process there, but anyway, so anger, I generally think that anger is far more limited in terms of guiding righteousness and love and evangelism. Anger moves us. And here's the thing, anger moves you, but true anger isn't enough to keep going. Anger moves you in the moment and then flares out. That's not true. That's not the anger of God. The anger of God towards injustice and poverty and spiritual poverty and biblical literacy it's a kind of deep-seated anger grounded in this is not a right state of affairs. And that kind of anger moves to prayer. Prayer that God would change things. So if anger doesn't move you to pray, I'm not sure it's the anger from above.
That's there's great wisdom in what he is saying, and turns out Star Wars was even more right than I thought. and so let's look at the other emotion that's been wrapped, because both parties have spent tons of money to convince people that if the other guy gets elected, America is over. There will never be another election. The whole place will fall apart. And so there's fearfulness, I think, and people, drive you to the poll, get you to vote, make money, all those kinds of things off of fear. And so as Christians, if we're experiencing that, Sergio, what words would you have for us?
I think that having a kingdom mentality, it really helps us to invest our energy and our hopes into something higher than the opportunity that we have here, in this world. I like what I learned from my friend, Dr. Miranda, the one to be with the Lord. He said that one of the blessings of the church community is that we can implement the things that we're not satisfied with, that we're not happy with in the world. We can create like an alternative community within our churches. And I love that. I love the potential that we have as a church to create something that we don't see in the world. And that's a beautiful potential and hope, to nurture our families, to work with our youth, even with our children, things that could be very fearful, for the way that we see how society is going, is deteriorating. To know that we have that opportunity and that we see it, we see changes. Christ does change people, and when you see how families turn from the way they were heading towards into something more productive and something that becomes a blessing not only for them but for others. I see great hope. One of the verses that was coming to mind when I was preparing for this podcast is Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. And I think we should always keep that in mind, that our speech will be peaceful, out of fear, out of hatred, out of those emotions, but to have the cross of Christ always insert in everything that we do and everything that we think, and the way we treat others. And I think that will bring peace to our hearts and to our communities.
And so we've been talking so much on the church in action, right? You mentioned that kingdom mentality, right? Jesus says the kingdom is here, right? You have access to it. And so if I'm struggling with things like fear, or I would even add anger and all these other things, if I'm not okay with what God is doing, my prayer should be that He would make me okay with what I'm doing, but I need to start engaging God more seriously in prayer, engaging God more seriously through scripture, engaging God more seriously through service. I need to engage God, and He will make me okay with what He is doing. Is that fair?
Well, that's the bottom line. I think that we can get caught up into the world systems, and we can disconnect from the source. And yes, we need to be more responsible when it comes to our true relationship with God.
Thanks. And Enoch, last word. What word would you have about fear if we're experiencing it?
Wow, that's a great question. Worthy of more podcasts. I guess I would say my general thought is whatever candidate wins, one side is greatly fearful. And I wonder if people generally can empathize with the fear of the other perspective. But that we don't need to be a Christian to have that. I think if a human in a certain position relieves me of fear, that's not wrong, but I think it's helpful to go, okay, how much hope am I putting in that human, in that institution, as good or even upright as that human institution may be, at least in some people's minds. But I think fear, perfect love casts out fear. I think fear is always about loss. When you do counseling. So fear means there's something that you're scared of losing. And I think it's worth identifying what I'm losing. Now, you do lose things. I was talking to some people, then if one candidate wins, there's goes funding for certain programs. If a different candidate wins, you go funding for there. So it's important to identify what that loss is so we can process that fear. And then if it's a fear that, if it's for our safety or well-being, then, ultimately we leave it to the Lord anyway. But I think fear, everyone has some fears. And I think the fear is often mispronounced or unspecified. So desensitization, one of the things you do in pastoral counseling is, what are you afraid of? I'm going to say this to this person. Well, what's the worst that can happen? And you talk them through it. One of the things, like you said, if this candidate wins, it's over, right? It could be that over for anyone who wins, right? But realistically, the resilience of the American democracy, though it's got some serious signs of wear in different places and it's very disturbing, I'm no scholar on this, but I just think that same with the January 6th. I don't think most people, though it was a great affront to our Capitol, I don't think anyone thought that even if you took over a building, that actually the American democracy would crumble or fall. I mean, it never even, not even, there's no fear in that. It's a quite audacious display of violence, assaulting the Capitol. I grant that, and that's true. But in no way did it make me ever think, well, the American experience is over because of that thing. But I do think that, Satan, when he leads, he doesn't lead through those fear. He actually leads through temptations and making you alluring things. So I think he uses fear to set you up and then gives you a solution. And then you don't even realize it. You're falling into his solution. I think Tolkien said that an agent of evil in Lord of the Rings, an agent of the evil would look more fair, but feel more foul. And so I think we're fearing often the wrong thing.
Tolkien are good words to end on. Sergio, Enoch, thank you both so much for being here. You both blessed me. You both shared with us some great wisdom and pastoral care. And so thank you both very much. And thanks for your ministries and your friendship.
Thank you. God bless you.
This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelists by helping the church make disciples, do justice, and foster unity so people want to know Jesus and New England's transformed. You can find more resources at visionnew.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.